everyone. This is a work session of the Portland City Council. Today's date is November 10th, 2020. The subject area is our legislative agenda, something we're all interested in hearing more about. And with that, Director Edwards, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you so much, and good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, Commissioner-elect, and viewers. My name is Elizabeth Edwards. I'm the Director of the Office of Government Relations for the City of Portland, and it is my distinct pleasure to be with you this morning, along with my team, to discuss the draft federal and state legislative agendas for 2021. You should have received drafts in your inbox on Friday, and we'll be walking through some of those materials today. A little bit about format. We're going to start first with the federal agenda, and then we'll move to the state. We'll be using PowerPoint to guide our discussion, and we'll make sure you get a copy of the PowerPoint afterwards. I also want to give a shout out to our associate, Haley Tortorella, for running our slides and doing all the hard behind the scenes work to help build these agendas and the presentation. And I'll just note that each member of my team will introduce themselves as they move forward to present their component of the presentation. So for both the federal and state presentations, we'll start by laying a shared foundation. We'll talk about election results and their impacts, important timelines, key issues, and then we'll move into the draft agendas to have a discussion about if what we've put before you is reflecting council's direction and what changes you may want to see. And just a reminder for everyone here, we really work very, very hard to ensure a consensus agenda for City Council and work to speak with one voice to our state and federal partners to the largest extent possible. This work session on our drafts is also preceding final approval of the agendas, which won't be until January 6th. And I'll share some next steps between now and then at the end. We have a full morning. I hope that you will ask questions as we go. And before we step into the federal presentation, I also want to express my sincere thanks to the Office of Equity and Human Rights Director, Dr. Markeisha Smith, who is joining us this morning. Building on past work, my office has been really intentional this year about centering racial equity in the building of these drafts, and we would not have been able to do that without Dr. Smith and her team for their engagement and feedback thus far. I also want to thank Bureau leadership and liaisons and equity managers for their assistance in conducting an equity analysis for items that are under consideration in the agenda. So it's my hope and intention that this good work in centering equity in the building of the agendas carries through with the advocacy, coalition building, and outcomes that we see in our work with other governments. So I want to pause for a second and see if Dr. Smith would like to offer any opening remarks this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Markeisha Smith, Director for the Office of Equity and Human Rights. And I'll just keep it brief. Have been really excited to engage with Elizabeth and her team. It was exciting for me, I think, because of my previous work at the Department of Ed in Salem. And so I'm very familiar with our state legislative process and just sort of jumping into conversations with Elizabeth. It was, refreshing to see the direction that we're headed in. I think that now more than ever, and I don't think that, I have to really sort of preach into the choir here. Now more than ever, we really need to center equity in the work that we're doing. We need to think about the legislative initiatives that we're supporting, and really does that, align with the values, the core values that we have, adopted as a city. I think that's really, really key. And I think there's been a lot of, as Elizabeth said, intentionality this time around how we are thinking about centering equity, how we're having conversations specific to racial equity, and thinking about like what all that means, as I said, particularly in the times that we are living in now. So I'm just excited, and I am looking forward to listening in and chiming in as needed. And I appreciate the invite, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful to work with you. So.
Thanks, Dr. Smith. Likewise. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Vicki Cram to kick off the federal presentation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, and Commissioners-elect. For the record, I'm Vicki Cram. I'm a principal at Squire Patton Boggs, and I work in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the city. We will move to the next slide. There we go. General election results is where I'm going to start off. President-elect, Biden claimed victory, and President Trump, as we all know, has yet to concede. There is no doubt that the country remains deeply divided, and this will impact the new administration's ability to accomplish their aspirations. A couple of dates related to the election as we move forward to bear in mind, and I wouldn't ordinarily spend so much time on this, but these are not ordinary times, as we know. November 4th through December 14th is the counting of popular votes and the filing of certificates of ascertainment. And certificates of ascertainment must list the names of the electors chosen by the voters and the number of votes. These are often signed by a state's governor and must carry the state seal. December 8th is the safe harbor deadline. The governor of any state where there was a contest and in which the contest was decided according to established state procedures is required to send a certificate describing the form and manner by which the determination was made to the archivist. Then December 14th, the Electoral College cast ballots in each state. December 23rd, the results of the Electoral College ballots are due. January 3rd, the 117th Congress is sworn in. January 6th, we have a joint session of Congress to certify Electoral College results. And January 20th is Inauguration Day, and that's 71 days from now. Clearly, there, as we all know, and we've been following the news, there are numerous lawsuits claiming fraud. So far, none of those have stuck. President-elect Biden is moving forward with his transition, which had begun prior to the election as required by law, and has posted his transition website, which highlights many of the themes that you will find in the city's federal agenda: economic recovery, racial equity, climate change, and most importantly, foremost, COVID-19 response. And that will be something that he is already working on. Yesterday, the president-elect appointed his own COVID-19 Transition Advisory Board comprised of public health officials. I do want to note that the General Services Administration has yet to give access to the Biden transition team for the next steps. This generally means an office in each agency and funding to prepare the transition. Mark Meadows, the White House Chief of Staff, has told the GSA to hold off until Friday when more recounts are completed. And yesterday, the Attorney General authorized prosecutors to probe election irregularities, which is hugely controversial considering that there is not any evidence of that. And I will talk a little bit more about the transition as we move forward. Next slide, please. So control of the US Senate is still undetermined. Georgia will have 2 runoffs on January 5th. A 50-50 split in the US Senate is possible, and is currently actually a 50-50 split because 2 independents, Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine, both caucus with the Democrats. If there is a 50-50 split in the US Senate, Vice President-elect Harris will be the tiebreaker if needed. Democrats maintain control of the House of Representatives. Currently, Democrats have lost 5 seats from their majority. Currently, 8 seats races yet to be called. So we expect probably a net loss of somewhere between 8 to 10, maybe 11 net loss seats for Democrats. And we expect that Speaker Pelosi will remain Speaker. The next slide. Oregon's congressional delegation. It remains largely the same with the exception of Congressman-elect Cliff Bentz, who will take Congressman Greg Walden's seat. Some of you will know him from the legislature. If Democrats were to take the Senate, Senator Ron Wyden would be chair of the powerful Senate Finance Committee. Congressman Peter DeFazio faced his hardest race in a long time, but he won. And as he is chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, he will be very important to any recovery or infrastructure legislation that Congress will address in the coming year. And the city enjoys a great working relationship with the delegation. And as you all know, they're very hardworking and effective on our behalf. So moving to the end of the 116th Congress and the lame duck session. The lame duck session.
Vicki, could I ask you a question?
Yes.
So you're in DC, it's the center of political intrigue. Everybody there talks all the time about nothing but politics. What is the message that you believe the Democratic majority is taking from the results that you just showed? So Biden and Harris have won, but we have potentially a split Congress. What we can definitely say at this point is it's close, and the Democrats actually lost ground in the House of Representatives. What messages are Democrats in Washington, D.C., or Republicans for that matter? What are people saying about what Americans are saying to the Democratic Party, or what they're saying to the power structure generally with those results?
Mayor, I think the Democrats are still sorting this out. They had a caucus meeting last week in which there was a little bit of pointing about, calling some Democrats calling themselves socialists. Did that make us lose some of the seats we had gained in the last 2 years ago? So I think they're still trying to sort out exactly how they position themselves. But there has to be a recognition that half the country voted for President Trump, a little less than half the country. And so I do think that it may scale back some of what is possible in the coming 2 years and in the lame duck session.
Thank you.
So the lame duck.
Mayor, if I may, before you go.
You bet. Yeah, jump on in.
Thank you. Speaking of the lame duck session, is there any chance in heck that anything productive will come out of that session?
I think actually something productive may come out of that session. And as I was going to say and talking about it, I think the big question is where the president is in terms of being willing to sign anything that does come out of the lame duck session. He's unpredictable, as we know. And so we need to see where he sort of falls on this. But I do think, particularly, we have the first order of business, Commissioner, is to keep the federal government operating. And the House passed 10 of 12 appropriations bills last year, or over the course of the year. The Senate didn't mark up any. And actually today, this morning, the Senate revealed their 12 appropriations bills for the first time. So we're operating under what's called a continuing resolution that expires on December 11th. And when Congress passed this continuing resolution, they included a full year reauthorization of the FAST Act, which is the Surface Transportation Bill, and also the National Flood Insurance Program, a full year reauthorization of those. We expect, there may be another short-term continuing resolution, but we expect that Congress will try to resolve the funding issues for FY21 during the lame duck session. They may have to do a short continuing resolution that takes them up to December 21st or something, but we think they will. They also have some must-do legislation, Commissioner, like the National Defense Authorization Act and possibly the Water Resources Development Act, which governs Army Corps of Engineers projects. So those may be completed. And finally, after many fruitless months of negotiations on a new round of COVID relief, stimulus funding, the last one being in March, Congress may come to an agreement on the stimulus during the lame duck session of Congress. Prior to the election, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was in negotiations with the White House on a stimulus package in the range of $2 million. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell largely stayed out of those negotiations, but attempted to bring targeted or a skinny package to the Senate floor right before they convened, right before they left for the election. The Democrats prevented that from happening. But now, Mitch McConnell has said that he's interested in renewing these negotiations and that he will be negotiating with Speaker Pelosi. And so the size of the package will be their first huge hurdle between the $500 billion that the Senate wants and the $2 trillion that the House wants. But we expect that they will start negotiations. that Speaker Pelosi will probably be coordinating with the Biden transition. And we think maybe there will be an agreement on a package, and that package would be maybe in the range of about $1 trillion. And the issues that they're looking at in that package are renewal of enhanced unemployment insurance, funding for testing, contact tracing, and vaccine development, another round of the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, for funding small businesses. Senator McConnell has been adamant about having some sort of liability protection for businesses and healthcare operators. There may be another round of $1,200 stimulus checks. And finally, a key issue for us, the City of Portland, along with our allies, the Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, we've been working on an additional round of funding to state and local governments to aid in COVID-19 response and to help offset lost revenues. And in addition to that, there may be an extension of the CARES Act, CRF, Corona Relief Fund, might be extended beyond the December 30th deadline. And McConnell has recently said that he is open to additional state and local funding, which he hadn't been prior to this. Congress may also take up expiring tax provisions and retirement reform. The big question mark about both the funding of the federal government beyond December 11th and the COVID relief package is whether the president will sign them and where he is in thinking about these things. In particular, the president already is hostile to democratically run and controlled cities, the same cities that helped put Vice President Biden over the top and have been celebrating his victory. And so the president may be inclined to punish those jurisdictions by demanding that any additional aid to cities in the recovery package be dropped. And that brings me to Portland's status declared by the administration as an anarchist jurisdiction, along with Seattle, New York City, and Washington, D.C. The president issued an executive order designed to remove all federal funding from his declared anarchist cities, and we have no reason to believe that he will give up this pursuit during the coming months. The city has worked with the other jurisdictions, the mayors, the Washington representatives for those cities, their delegations, and city attorneys to coordinate a lawsuit, press releases, and messaging. We also successfully sought the support of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and garnered support from other mayors like Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. So that's a very long answer to your question, Commissioner, but it remains to be seen what we can get done.
Mr. Mayor and Vicki, can I jump in and ask a quick question? This is Mengus.
Jump in.
I think this question goes to Vicki. Is the concept, I'm trying to get my head around this term, anarchist jurisdiction. Is that a legal term or is that more of just a civic insult?
I'll answer this one for you, Vicki. So Mingus, this is the name of my new punk band.
I can't wait to see them when COVID lifts.
I don't think it's a legal definition. And it's certainly, but taking funds away from a city is not constitutionally allowed. Congress, as you know, has the power of the purse strings. And so, I assume that if this goes on and this continues to happen during the rest of the Trump administration, I assume that our lawsuit will move fairly quickly and potentially, will protect us. If there's
at every step so far, the administration has lost. There has been no legal grounding so far that would give them any reason to believe that they could withhold federal funding that we are entitled to, either based on formulas or other criteria that are established by the different agencies. And so far, they have not been victorious. It will continue, though, to be problematic just in terms of gaining support for the kinds of things we want to do until January.
Cool. And may I ask one more clarification question?
Of course. Yes.
And can you give us a 30-second, I want this on the record, which is why I'm asking, can you give us a 30-second overview of the specific cuts that the administration wants to make to our funding because we've been described as an anarchist jurisdiction? What are they threatening to pull? Or can you get, if you can't do all of it, give us some examples.
So we know that they have been looking into transportation funding. And so that is very much on their minds. They've also been looking into the Department of Health and Human Services funding. So that means everything from, child care to health grants. So it's a very broad spectrum that they're looking at. And, a lot of those funds and our COVID relief funds. So a lot of those funds are absolutely necessary for the city to be able to operate, and for Seattle and for New York and for the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for clarifying that for me.
Yeah, and if I could hop in with one other just clarifying point, the oxymoronic term of an anarchist jurisdiction came from the White House and from a memorandum from the White House that began this whole process of evaluating what sources of funding they could withdraw or cut off.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And so I'm really curious. Based on what we saw in the last COVID relief package, do we really want to advocate for any COVID relief package from this administration? Is it just going to be another big giveaway to big businesses and a trickle effect for the people that are suffering on the ground? I mean, the last one was horrifically unequitable.
Well, that is a decision for you all to make, but there was enhanced unemployment insurance. There were stimulus checks directly to people. There was funding for testing. It wasn't well managed necessarily, but for testing and for contact tracing. So there were some funds that did directly impact, individuals and people.
Very minimally as compared to huge business giveaways that were done in that package. If you weigh the pros and cons of what we got, we would have been better off with no stimulus package than getting what we ended up ultimately receiving. So I'm just concerned this particular Congress trying to get anything through will be very beneficial for a very small group of people and won't actually move the needle at all for the majority of people who are suffering through this crisis. So, I don't see much. I'm more optimistic about the next Congress than I am about this one doing something that actually will be helpful.
Well, and as you commented initially, Commissioner, this may not happen during the lame duck session, and then we will be in the new Congress in January trying to craft something that would be, that may potentially be quite different.
Vicki, could I ask a question? And this may not be a right question for you to answer. This may be for Elizabeth, in which case I'll hold off. Are there any, and maybe the discussion hasn't even begun, but is there any expectation of a change to the formula distribution that was used during the last CARES Act? In other words, will the dollars be going to large jurisdictions directly, or will it be going through the state for allocation? Has there been any discussion about that? And the second part of that question is, are there ongoing discussions here at the state level that in the event that there is direct distribution, are we going to avoid some of the confusion that we had last time about reallocating to smaller jurisdictions and the like? Has there been any discussion about the structure of another package?
There has been, Mayor, and in the House passed two COVID relief packages, the HEROES Act and then HEROES Act 2.0. In both of those, the state and local funding, the states got a certain amount of funding, but the cities got a modified CDBG formula. It doesn't mean that you have to use it for CDBG uses. It would be for COVID relief, and it would also be for lost revenue. But it would go out through a CDBG formula to entitlement cities. So that's 70%. And then the other 30% would go to the state and must be distributed by the state to smaller non-entitlement communities, as small as townships. And then additionally, there's a separate pot for counties that goes to all counties based on population. So there was a real recognition that the Corona Relief Fund in the CARES Act, which was put together in the middle of the night, was patently unfair. A lot of jurisdictions received no funding, or they had to petition their county or their city or their state for funding. And so the attempt to rectify that is this formula, which was devised by the National Association of Counties, the National League of Cities, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors.
Good. I'm glad to see that has been repaired. And I also just want to thank my colleagues. The way that we handled this here in the city of Portland and throughout Multnomah County, I think was really exceptional. And it didn't lead to the kind of real harm and interjurisdictional squabbling that ensued in other parts of the country. So I really want to thank my colleagues for the great work we did collaboratively with our East County jurisdictions.
Elizabeth, do you want to address anything about the state?
I actually think the answer about how the money will flow through the sort of well-worn path of CDBG answers some of the questions around the jockeying that we had to do with the state with regard to the creative structure that the coronavirus relief fund dollars took. So hopefully that addresses the mayor's second question.
Good. So then if there are no more questions right now, I will move on to the next slide, which is the transition to a new administration and a new Congress. As we mentioned earlier, the House is likely to have lost some seats, but retains the majority, and the Senate at this moment in time is tied with those two Georgia seats outstanding. Should the Senate remain in Republican hands, this could be a recipe for total gridlock, or there might be some opportunities for the White House and Congress to work together. It's important to remember that President-elect Biden is an institutionalist and a creature of the Senate. He was the deal maker for important legislation during the Obama administration, largely coordinating between then House Speaker John Boehner and Senate Majority Leader McConnell. Biden and Senate Majority Leader McConnell have been friends and colleagues for 40 years. Additionally, Biden has stated, and I think he genuinely believes, that he can bring the country together. And in that vein, there might be some opportunity for collaboration, initially on a stimulus or infrastructure package in the first 100 days. In fact, Biden has vowed to begin the process of an infrastructure bill as early as February, with the re-election of Oregon's Peter DeFazio, chair of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Oregon and the city will be well positioned to impact the legislation positively, as we did in the development of an infrastructure bill this year. But it may not be completely easy. President-elect Biden will need to get his cabinet posts through a Republican-controlled Senate, if that's what it is. If it is a tied Senate, then Vice President-elect Harris will be the tie-breaking vote. And if the Senate flips to Democratic control, then the new administration will have an easier path to enacting legislation, working with Chuck Schumer of New York, who would very likely be the Senate Majority Leader. But even if that is the case, it's easy to block votes in the Senate, and the country remains deeply divided along partisan lines, so we have to remember that. We expect that Biden will announce key White House positions first, perhaps as soon as this week. Chief of Staff is likely to be Ron Klain or Steve Ricchetti, who were both former chiefs of staff to him when he was vice president. Leading contenders for cabinet posts, as they were in the Obama administration, include many local government officials, including potentially Atlanta Mayor Bottoms for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as affordable housing has been a key focus of hers as mayor. South Bend Mayor Buttigieg for the Veterans Administration or as UN Secretary, and Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles for the Department of Transportation. Although I must say here that our very own Congressman Earl Blumenauer is very much in the running for that spot, so that may be his. Another Pacific Northwesterner, Washington Governor Jay Inslee, may be in line for the Department of Energy or another position in the administration.
Vicki, can I stop you right there?
Yes.
Because I want us all to absorb what was just said. We have outstanding relationships with every individual that you just named. Mm-hmm. this could be a key partnership opportunity for the city of Portland. We have solid relationships with all of those people who are at least rumored at this point to potentially be high-level administration officials. Think about how different that will be going forward compared to what we've had over the last, the last several years. So that's good news. I did have one question. Are there any rumors of a bipartisan cabinet, or at least a few bipartisan cabinet selections? Do we know anything about that?
We have heard rumors that is a potential, in the same way that Obama had Chuck Hagel in his cabinet or Ray LaHood in his cabinet. I think that might be something that would be seriously considered by the Biden administration. I don't know who it would be, but I think that is under serious consideration.
Thank you, appreciate it.
To go on to administration priorities, and I'll try and go through this relatively quickly because I know we're pressed for time, but these are important. First, we'll talk about executive orders. On the very, very first day, Biden has vowed to repeal many of the executive orders that were put in place by the Trump administration, such as the transgender ban on serving in the military, reinstatement of deferred action for childhood arrivals, and repeal of the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. On COVID-19 response, tackling the coronavirus, which is currently surging, as we all know, will be job one in the first 100 days, with a national plan and a national federal plan, I want to make sure we know that, of additional protective gear for health workers, distribution of masks, and a federal mask mandate potentially, increased national testing capacity to 7.5 million a week, establishing a new U.S. public health job corps for contact tracing, and funding for schools and funding for the development of a vaccine. The president-elect would also re-engage with the World Health Organization. He has said he will appoint a national supply chain commander and establish a pandemic testing board similar to President Roosevelt's wartime production panel. An important part of his COVID-19 response would be additional stimulus funds that includes aid to state and local governments. On racial equity, the Biden administration would spur private investment through new small business opportunity programs, make bold investments in home ownership, access to affordable housing for Black, Brown, and Native families, and promote diversity and accountability in leadership across key positions in federal agencies. They have also committed to work with Congress to pass police reform legislation, including a nationwide ban on chokeholds, stopping the weapons of war to police forces, improving oversight and accountability, and creating a model use of standard force. A model use of force standard, as well as the creation of a National Police Oversight Commission. Criminal justice reform is also high on the agenda. Moving on to the infrastructure package, the Biden-Harris administration would early in the year, and this is an area which is ripe for bipartisan cooperation, champion a 10-year, $1.3 trillion plan to invest in traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, et cetera, but also speed the transition to low and zero carbon vehicles and invest in climate resiliency, adaptation, and clean energy infrastructure. Their plan would also bolster broadband expansion to underserved communities. We will be working to include housing as infrastructure in any package that is developed. On the Affordable Care Act, Vice President Biden, or President-elect Biden, can immediately restore funds to market the law's coverage options, extend the annual enrollment period, and unlike Trump, make it easier for more people to buy coverage outside of the typical sign-up during a pandemic. He's also likely to try unwinding a host of Trump's regulatory actions, like an expansion of cheaper and skimpier health insurance options that don't comply with Obamacare, and restrictions on poor immigrants' access to public benefits like Medicaid, public charge. As we know, today the U.S. Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments in the Texas versus U.S. case on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. Biden and Congress could move to intervene prior to a court ruling in late spring next year to save the ACA if they need to. Addressing homelessness, the incoming administration has promised to order a new fight against homelessness and houselessness, construct 1.5 million homes, and roll back Trump's rescission of the Obama era affirming furthering fair housing rule. And on climate change, while it's unlikely that a wholesale Green New Deal will pass the 117th Congress, there will be an overlay in the infrastructure package with opportunities to invest in sustainable infrastructure and new energy grids. Biden may look to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, to build out a clean energy agenda, and there's potential for some tariffs on high carbon goods from overseas. The nation will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord on Inauguration Day. And finally, it is likely that many of the regulations promulgated during the past 4 years will be reversed, but that is a longer and more deliberative process. Notices have to be posted, comments have to be received, et cetera. Then as a very final note, with regards to the federal debt, Congress will have to come up with a new budget agreement early next year, as the 10-year agreement that we've been operating under expires at the end of this year, and the federal debt ceiling will need to be raised again, probably by late spring or early summer. So if there are no more questions, I will turn it over to Dan to move forward.
Thank you, Vicki. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, and Commissioners-elect. I'm Dan Eisenbeis, the Deputy Director and Regional Liaison within the Office of Government Relations. Before turning things over to Niels Tillstrom to discuss the draft federal and legislative and regulatory agenda, I will review the status of the census and reapportionment process, as well as a few notable ballot measure trends from the November election. As you know, the census count recently concluded work on October 15th, placing us midway through the process that will result in apportionment of seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. After missing out on an additional 6th congressional seat by approximately 41,000 to 42,000 people in 2010, Oregon is expected to gain a 6th congressional seat this time around. If awarded, the new seat will apply with the 2022 elections for the congressional session that starts in 2023. Federal statute directs Secretary
Mr. Mayor, Daniel, can I jump in here and ask a question? I think to Daniel.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is probably, I don't know if this is your area of expertise. We just tried to complete a census under pretty remarkable circumstances, led by an administration that was not too enthusiastic about actually getting the job done and getting the job done correctly. Do we have any assessment of how well our census count went here in Oregon?
So I don't think that I can necessarily characterize how well it went, but I can tell you that the city of Portland advocated for a complete and accurate count. And we were certainly on the record, and the mayor was on the record advocating for the deadline to not be truncated prematurely. As it ended up, the census count concluded about 2 weeks earlier than the initial deadline. The Trump administration also originally said that they were going to delay getting apportionment counts to the states, but that would require a statutory change. So the federal statute directs the Secretary of Commerce to provide the tabulation of apportionment population to the president by December 31st. The Census Bureau has traditionally publicly released that tabulation around the same time. And it is worth noting that that includes for each state the total resident population, including both citizens and non-citizens. However, the president has made clear that his intent is to somehow subtract undocumented immigrants from the figures that are used for reapportionment. That move has resulted in ongoing litigation. In September, a U.S. District Court in New York ruled that the administration policy violates statutory authority. They did not directly rule on a constitutional question. And the U.S. Supreme Court in October indicated that they will take up the case and hear oral arguments on November 30th. After they announced that, a different US District Court in California ruled that the Trump administration policy violates both statute as well as the US Constitution. So looking forward, the Census Bureau will have until March 31st of next year to provide redistricting data to states. And in Oregon, the state legislature will be responsible for adopting new congressional district boundaries by July 1st of next year. State statute provides that if they fail to do so, adjudication is possible through a special judicial panel appointed by the Chief Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court. It's worth noting that the process for state legislative district redistricting in Oregon is a little bit different in that if the legislature does not adopt a plan, responsibility for drafting a plan will shift to the Oregon Secretary of State. And Commissioner-elect, before we move on, I just want to make sure, did I adequately address your question?
I think it's best as we can. I think this raises a whole bunch of questions, but I'll let us move on. But you did great.
Okay, happy to follow up with additional information if that's helpful.
Sure.
So turning to ballot measures, there were a number of ballot measures across the country that voters were voting on both at the state and local levels that could have the potential to influence federal policy conversations moving forward, as well as legislative discussions here in Oregon and elsewhere. Voters took steps to remove racist legacies from state symbols and constitutions in a number of states. In Mississippi and Rhode Island, voters removed overt symbols of the Confederacy and slavery from their state flag and name, respectively. Also in Mississippi, voters repealed the state electoral college system that it had had for statewide office elections since its 1895 Constitutional Convention, which is also when they had adopted the flag that they just got rid of that had the Confederate battle flag as part of the flag. Elsewhere in Nebraska and Utah, voters removed provisions from the respective state constitutions that allowed the use of slavery and involuntary servitude as criminal punishments. The actions in those two states follow a similar ballot measure that passed in Colorado in 2018. And like the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution and constitutions in 22 other states, including Oregon, those three states had constitutional provisions allowing for criminal punishment as an exception to the prohibition of slavery and involuntary servitude. Turning to the next slide, several cities and counties across the US passed police and criminal justice reform measures. In addition to Portland, jurisdictions passing measures to establish or strengthen police oversight bodies included King County, Washington, Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, San Diego, Columbus, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. And voters in Los Angeles County also approved a measure that requires 10% of the county's unrestricted general funds to be allocated to address the disproportionate impact of racial injustice through community investment and alternatives to incarceration. Lastly, I want to note that voters in 5 states approved cannabis legalization measures.
Excuse me for just a sec. Daniel, is it possible to get copies of the legislation around police reform that you just talked about?
I'm happy to follow up with additional information and links.
Thank you.
Please, Bengus here. Please copy me on those two.
Certainly will do so.
Thank you.
So voters in Arizona, Montana, and New Jersey legalized adult use recreational cannabis. And in South Dakota, voters legalized both adult use recreational as well as medical use cannabis. And in Mississippi, voters approved medical use cannabis. Looking nationally for the totality of states that have legalized cannabis, there are 34 states, as well as the District of Columbia, that have now legalized either adult use or medical use cannabis. And we are increasingly seeing states in traditionally Republican-controlled regions approve adult use cannabis. If there are no other questions, I'd like to turn it over to Niels Tillstrom.
Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, and Commissioner-elect. My name is Niels Tillstrom, and I am the Federal Relations Manager in the Office of Government Relations. And I appreciate the context that my colleagues, Vicki and Dan, provided for the federal agenda. The next several slides will cover the items in the draft 2021 federal legislative agenda. The full draft and a two-pager version has been sent to your teams on Friday, and the language on these slides is similar to the language that was contained on that two-pager. So I'll go over each of the 7 sections in the draft agenda and provide the context for the agenda items. And these items were made part of the agenda through input from bureaus and council offices, as well as conversations with our congressional delegation, national partners, and community stakeholders. So this is an opportunity for you to provide input, and feel free to call out items that you think are missing, edits you'd like to see, and I'm more than happy to take questions along the way. So the first section of advocacy is devoted to the COVID-19 pandemic response. The city is advocating for crucial federal resources, policies, and practices to address the economic security and public health needs of all Portlanders while prioritizing vulnerable populations. These priorities focus on keeping families and individuals housed and with access to food, water, heat, and power, and stability of the crisis. COVID-19 has caused far-reaching negative impacts on local and global economies and significant harm to Portland households and businesses alike. And the items in this section of the agenda reflect those needs. So just want to pause here for any questions you may have on what's listed.
I have a question.
Please.
So when the vaccine is available, is it going to be free?
That's a very good question. I think that it could be determined as part of federal legislation. I think that the Biden administration seems to have significant financial support given to acquiring and distributing the vaccine. And I think that, I think maybe Vicki may have some more insight on this, but there has been discussion about how to distribute that vaccine in the most equitable way possible.
Great, thank you. I know we're not making policy today, but I think it's very important that especially low-income Portlanders have access to free vaccination shots. We know this crisis is having a disproportionate impact on folks at the low end of the income spectrum and people of color. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
Any more questions on this slide? Okay. So moving on to the next area is racial justice. The city of Portland is advocating for anti-racist policy at the federal level and to strive for more equitable outcomes for our community members. The city recognizes and acknowledges impacts of public policy that lead to inequitable outcomes and is actively engaged in evaluating and challenging its own practices, and will advocate for the federal government to address a number of policies, including these here on the screen.
So Niels, I have a question. I think one of the things that was crystal clear this election season is that we have some people who stand in line 6, 7, 8 hours to vote. And so though we've had strengthening voter protections on our list for a while, I think we have to be very intentional about what it is we're fixing. And so I hope that after this next legislative convening next year, that no one actually has to stand in line for 6 to 8 hours to exercise their right to vote. The fact that this continues to happen in the United States of America, whether Democrats or Republicans are in control, and what we saw with this administration is they're removing opportunities for people to exercise their right to vote. So I would hope that our agenda would be very intentional about making sure that we're closing all of these loopholes that actually have a devastating impact on Black and brown people trying to exercise their right to vote.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And may I ask, I think I'm going to break my promise to the mayor and ask a dumb question, if I may. Just so I understand where we are in this presentation, are we looking, am I essentially looking at our draft legislative agenda that comes from Portland that we're going to advocate for down in DC?
That's correct. And right now in front of you, you have a short, like the short 7-word synopsis of what an item looks like. So yes, yeah. So this is the point in which you have input to push and pull and make things how you'd like to see them. And obviously the conversation continues after this work session.
Sure. And just for my benefit and for the benefit of anyone who's kind of tuning in for the first time, can you tell us the process that we went through to get to where we are today, or to get to this slide? Like, how did we go about developing this draft legislative agenda? Did we talk to bureau heads? Did you guys kind of just brainstorm?
Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth, do you want to cover all of it, or do you want me to?
I'm happy to. So fantastic question. We start our agenda building process over the summer, late summer into fall, and we put out a call for issues to all of our bureaus, saying what are the barriers or things that you would like to see changed at the state or federal government in order to help you do your job better. And this time around, we actually also included a section for bureaus to do an equity analysis. If we were to be successful in passing or achieving the proposed solution, what would be the equity impact at the end of the day? But we also go out and we meet with members of the delegation, state legislators. We were really intentional about reaching out to community-based organizations, getting additional input that way, and vetting to also see, and I think this is maybe a little bit more on the state side, what is the lay of the land? What is active? Where are areas where we can also partner and amplify and lift up so that it's not necessarily the city of Portland as the tip of the spear on every single one of these items. And we have a lot of pieces where we know that we've been advocating for certain items for many, many years, especially on the federal side, because the timing of how things go just takes so much longer. And then we come before you for this work session, and then we'll get good feedback, and we'll do follow-up, whether it's with subject matter experts or with folks in stakeholders in the community, circling back with each one of your offices, and then we'll try and build something that looks like a consensus agenda on behalf of council.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long process.
Hi, I have a quick question. It's kind of a point of order.
Yeah.
And also, when I say this, I really appreciated all the questions, especially from Commissioner-elect Maps. I had many of the same ones. I think we have more influence when it comes to what happens in Salem. And so I just want to have a point of order. Are we going to spend the second hour on Salem in the state?
Yes, that's correct, Commissioner.
Okay.
And so we're the preamble on the state side is a little bit shorter because it's not quite as dramatic as what's happening at the
right.
State level.
I'm just doing it from a geeky control and influence standpoint. So.
Fantastic.
Thanks. Sure.
All right. If there are no more questions on this slide, we can move to the next slide. So climate and environmental justice. The city of Portland recognizes this critical juncture to invest in a swift transition to clean energy while reducing energy costs for low income and the most vulnerable in our communities. This work will center on the protection of and well-being of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and builds on resilience and stability to withstand future crises. Effective implementation of these goals can only truly be met with intentional and robust federal engagement and support. To further the actions taking place at the local and regional level, the city is advocating for these federal policies.
And I think this is also, that last stream was also an opportunity just to highlight that these policies were also informed by our tribal relations lead, Laura John. And in the full list, you'll see support for tribal sovereignty, but there's a lot of different elements that are woven in throughout both the federal and state agenda.
So, and I should have asked this of Vicki, but I'll ask it of you because you probably know the answer as well. I assume that on the list of immediate executive orders of the Biden-Harris administration is returning us to Paris Climate Accord.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
And Mayor, the administration is vowed to do that on the very first day, on the inauguration day.
Fabulous. Thank you.
So moving to the next slide, maintaining local authority and opposing preemption. The local authority is critical to the City of Portland's ability to nimbly and effectively respond to both community and city operational needs. The city is actively seeking legislation to enable more flexibility and conversely oppose efforts to curtail its authority to develop and enforce local ordinances and voter-approved measures, manage its bureaus and their functions, and maintain and raise revenue consistent with the city's prior principles and values. This is a body of work we felt would fluctuate between taking a majority of our time in a potential further Trump administration to something that will take still a fair amount of time, but would not see, I guess, the urgency in the Biden administration.
Thank you for this page. It's very helpful to see the focus between now and when this person leaves the White House.
You're welcome. So moving to infrastructure investment, the city and its regional partners seek increased and sustainable federal transportation infrastructure funding. And a strong federal partner is crucial to the development of a multimodal transportation system that promotes equity and mobility, supports the economy, meets Vision Zero goals, invests in electrification infrastructure, and protects the environment. To these ends, the city is advocating for federal action and policies that are seen here. So on community and economic development, the city is committed to advocate for federal funding and policies that invest in people, housing, and local businesses, and is committed to support economic recovery while simultaneously transitioning to a cleaner, more sustainable, resilient, and more equitable economy. The city is advocating for federal funding and policies that invest in people, housing, and local businesses. And we feel advocating for these policies will further our community and economic development goals. And finally, public safety and first response. The obligation to keep the public safe rests in many hands. The city is advocating for federal funding and policies to develop public safety solutions that best fit the needs of our community and allow all Portlanders to feel safe. These federal agenda items reflect this.
More and more states passing it. It seems like we might be able to finally make some headway on this because it's very, and it's one of our growing revenue streams. So this is important. Do you think that we have potential to finally move the dial on federal banking regulations that are more compatible for the cannabis industry?
I think so. I think that Dan highlighted the point that there are, we've well passed the 50% mark of states that have acted to legalize some form of use. And in considering that a number of the states that are now voting, their populations are voting to legalize cannabis in some form, you're moving into more and more, Republican-controlled states and more traditionally conservative areas. And so you would see the need for, some momentum, some political momentum to move in this way. I should note that some funding in the last 4 years that went to universities to study the use of CBD and cannabinoids went to Oregon and Kentucky. It went to McConnell and Senator Wyden. So there is bipartisanship in where in some of these cannabis issues. So
I'm sure our federal delegation is all over this, but
absolutely.
And obviously,
and if I can just add, the Safe Banking Act in 2019 passed the House. It may be included in a COVID relief package. Where it goes in the Senate right now, without knowing, who's going to be in control in the Senate, remains to be seen. But it not only has passed the House, but it has House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy is one of the co-sponsors of the bill.
okay, thank you so much.
And the Small Business Disaster Relief Equity Act is a bill that was introduced by our federal delegation to address the situations where cannabis businesses who are impacted by federally declared disasters did not have access to FEMA funds. So a number of businesses that were impacted by this season's wildfires were not able to access FEMA dollars.
Commissioner Udaley has her hand raised.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to quickly, hi, Vicki, good morning. Nice to see you. Touch on the SAFE Act for cannabis banking. We've seen robberies of cannabis businesses, I think, triple during COVID. So I just really want to emphasize how important this is to our local cannabis business community, as well as the state. Everybody, clearly everyone knows they have a lot of cash on hand and also product that's easy to resell on the black market. So they're particularly vulnerable. And so far, they also haven't qualified for federal disaster relief. And between COVID, which although we are seeing record revenues for cannabis tax, that doesn't mean that every cannabis business is doing well through this economic crisis, but they also were hard hit by the fires over the summer. And especially growers are going to need relief. So just want to emphasize that for my colleagues. This is a very important industry to our city and to our state, and they've really been left with no relief. And then I just want to quickly comment on rent and mortgage forgiveness. Vicki, do you have any idea if HR 6515, which is Congresswoman Omar's bill for, I can't remember the exact title of it off the top of my head, Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act of 2020. There hasn't been a vote in the House Financial Services Committee. Do you know if it's just dead in the water? If it may move, or we're talking about a whole different strategy?
Commissioner, it's good to see you too. I think that it may move. I think there is a national recognition that the continuance of the eviction moratorium and mortgage moratorium is necessary, given where we are with the pandemic. I do think that this may be actually something that the Biden administration may do early on, is extend it and address that. I think that there is good chance if there is COVID legislation that will be included in COVID legislation.
So again, I just would like to emphasize for my colleagues, this is This is an issue that we're unlikely to be able to deal with at the local and state level. It's critical that we get federal assistance. This bill includes forgiveness of rent and mortgage payments, as well as relief for landlords and lenders, and I think a fund for purchasing distressed properties. I might add that we really need universal eviction defense, something that I tried to fund through the fall bump amendments, and those amendments failed. And we're anticipating around 10,000 people facing eviction once the moratorium has been lifted. People who just will be unable to stay current with their rent or catch up with their deferred rent. And if we do not have a plan in place to help them, we're going to see a tidal wave of evictions and a massive increase in our homeless population. And it's, as we know, will be much more expensive down the line to deal with that. So it's pretty critical that we keep people housed. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Could you go back to public safety for just a sec, please?
Sure thing.
So there's, and I'm not quite sure where this issue should go. As we were talking about the cannabis expansion around the country, it occurs to me that we need federal expulsion of marijuana crimes for folks who were caught up when we were doing our war on drugs. Is that on our agenda anywhere? Any federal relief around expungement of marijuana convictions?
It is, Commissioner. It actually is on the slide previous to this. And quite frankly, we were trying to figure out where to put it, but it is the MORE Act. And the MORE Act deals with expungement.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to figure out if I saw it on there, trying to figure out what it looks like. It's the
cannabis. Yeah, so cannabis is an issue, obviously, that straddles a lot of the issue areas that we dealt with. You know, right. Could easily be put in the racial justice section as well. So we can have a conversation about where it lives.
Yeah, my vote would be under the racial justice agenda.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, we'll touch a little bit more on that on the state legislative agenda. So I may take this opportunity to start to pivot us into the second half of our presentation. We have about 50 minutes remaining, which I think keeps us pretty much on track at this point. Similar to the federal presentation for the state, draft state legislative agenda will be still covering election results and their impacts. That will be shorter. We'll also talk about important timelines and key issues and leadership priorities for the upcoming session, and all that will lay the foundation for our draft agenda. And like the federal agenda, the state agenda is still being crafted, and we'll be covering some of the complicating circumstances around the 2021 legislative session in particular that have made this process especially dynamic. So as before, members of my team will be introducing themselves as they hop in. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Eric Knoll.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, and Commissioner-elect. My name is Eric Knoll. I'm the state lobbyist with the Office of Government Relations. I'll set the stage with a post-election recap for the state legislature before handing the presentation over to Stacey Cowan to talk about the timeline and trends heading into the next legislative session. Here is a brief legislative overview. Following the November 3rd election, most of the statewide executive offices remained the same, with the exception of the Oregon Secretary of State. Senator Shemia Fagan was elected to serve as the next Secretary of State in Oregon. In the state legislature, the balance of power remains largely unchanged, with a few legislative races that do remain close prior to certification of the election. The Oregon Senate is expected to remain at an 18-12 Democrat to Republican majority, while the House is expected to have a Democrat majority of 37-23, with House Republicans gaining 1 seat. This means that Democrats are likely to retain supermajorities in both chambers of the Oregon legislature, which provide them a pathway again this session to take votes on tax measures without needing Republicans to vote in favor of those measures. However, as we've seen with past sessions, this supermajority threshold is not enough to be walkout proof, so to speak. A few of the close races that we are keeping an eye on, while all Oregon legislative races have been called by major media outlets, there are some races that have tightened as the remaining ballots have been counted. In House District 57 in Hood River, incumbent Democrat Representative Anna Williams is leading her opponent Jeff Helfrich by 94 votes as of the count this morning. In Senate District 10 in Salem, Democrat Deb Patterson has a slim lead over incumbent Republican Senator Denise Bowles with a 387 vote difference as of this morning. And in Senate District 27 in Bend, incumbent Republican Senator Tim Knopp is leading Democrat Eileen Keeley with approximately 1,500 vote difference. One thing we will also pay attention to as we head into the legislative session is the leadership of both the Democrat and Republican caucuses, as each of those caucuses will hold elections prior to the session. And this will have implications for committee membership and who chairs key committees in the Oregon legislature. The only caucus to hold elections so far is the House Republican caucus, re-electing Representative Drazen as the House Republican leader yesterday. A couple of key trends to note. Though the power balance remains largely the same, there are a few key seats in the Oregon legislature that flipped party control, including 3 seats on the Oregon coast that changed from Democrat to Republican control, as well as a Senate seat in Salem and a House seat in Bend that shifted from Republican to Democrat control. What this shows is a further sharpening of the urban-rural divide, specifically as we see partisan representation shift further to resemble the urban and rural geographic boundaries of our communities. Shifting to the next slide.
Could I jump in on this? Because this is an issue that I spend a considerable amount of time thinking about. And the first question is, what are the consequences of that urban-rural divide? And I would argue that those consequences are material and that they are significant. And there's probably no area where that partnership comes into play more than around transportation measures, but also we've seen it now with regard to COVID strategies, and we have seen it on more of a local level with regard to human services infrastructure, homelessness infrastructure, and the like, and the relative lack of infrastructure in rural areas, and therefore people rely more heavily on the infrastructure that exists in urban areas and the like. The best opportunity for us is around economic prosperity. And I believe around energy generation and clean energy usage, there are opportunities to bridge the urban-rural divide and create some partnerships. And so I'd like us, as we go down to Salem, to think about what some of these opportunities are and what sort of policies or strategies or legislative changes might make partnerships more viable. Particularly, I would say on the climate front, the energy generation front, CLT front, and that sort of thing. There are opportunities here to bridge the divides to our mutual benefit. I'd like us to think about it. Dan Saltzman used to insist every year that our legislative agenda include a specific section supporting policies and ideas that would bridge the urban-rural divide. And I don't know that we need to be that formal about it, but I really do hope that this, being that we are the leaders of the largest urban jurisdiction in the state, that we really do think about how we can play a key role in bridging some of those divides.
Absolutely, Mayor. And I think, one of the many challenges with the pandemic this summer is typically between a short session and a long session, we would actually be going out to have conversations with legislators in district to do some of that direct outreach and building of goodwill. And so that was a missed opportunity this summer because of the pandemic. The other thing that my team has certainly noted when we are working and building relationships with folks from all over Oregon is, especially for legislators that come from a local government background, that's another area where we've been able to really work very pragmatically together, because a lot of the challenges that come up for Portland are challenges that come up for Burns, are challenges that come up for Vail and Hermiston and all across the state. So that's been another area where we've been able to really partner.
Commissioner Fritz has done a good job of maintaining those relationships through the League of Cities. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's an important forum. And then there was, of course, the Metropolitan Mayors Forum that I participated in, that is a little bit in limbo, of course, as a result of COVID, and also Shane Bemis's retirement as the chair. He was really instrumental in bringing that group together. But I would be interested, not just in terms of the legislative session, but moving forward, how we could be more intentional about bridging some of these divides. The next 4 years is really about healing and closing the wounds and bridging the divides and finding those opportunities. There are two hands raised. I'll start with Commissioner Fritz, and I don't know if Commissioner Daly, if her hand is raised or if that's all. That's all. Okay, Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning the League of Cities. I have really appreciated getting to know people from Hermiston and other places around the state. And I will suggest that one of the things that the League is doing, there's always going to be the question of urban-rural divide. And we have now adopted caucuses within the League, so that there are going to be different ways for people to find commonalities, whether it's people of color, LGBTQ, whatever that might be. There is the ability now for those groups to form. I also have appreciated getting to know the women on the councils in the metro area, and I hope that group will continue, because even in the metro area, we've had some pretty stark differences of opinion in the past, and I'm hopeful that we are being brought together by some of the challenges that we're facing.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for your service on the League. It's I've seen major changes in some of their structure based on your advocacy.
Mr. Mayor, may I ask a question?
Yeah, if I can find my unmute button. Yes, you may.
Thank you very much. I think I want to direct this. I'm directing this question to staff, and maybe if some of the electeds have a view on this too. I'm trying to get a sense in Oregon in this last election. Did we become more polarized? Is it pretty much a status quo thing? What's your assessment of sort of how things have changed? And I don't know who's in a position to answer that.
I'll take director's privilege on that one. I think to some of the narrow margins on these votes that Eric mentioned, we're seeing some of those narrow margins also across the country, showing a real kind of polarization and folks being fairly evenly divided, which has been a really interesting trend to watch. And people also starting to sort a little bit differently geographically, seeing the coast become more red and seeing Central Oregon become more blue. One of the major themes that I think is impacting polarization is, in fact, that we have all been very much wrapped in the national chaos that was coming out of the current administration. And when national politics become our local politics, it ends up there's not as much room for common ground. And so that has led to some of the toxicity that we've been experiencing. And when you look at the last 2 state legislative sessions having ended with walkouts, I am cautiously optimistic that we can do what the mayor mentioned and spend the next 4 years healing some of those wounds as we get back to business for Oregon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
Eric, you want to proceed?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So on to the next slide to give a preview of some of the new members of the legislature. In the Senate, we anticipate 6 new members of the legislature and 13 in the House of Representatives. The positions here in bold are members of the Portland Legislative Delegation. A couple quick notes that the Senate District 10 seat in Salem is an election to fill out the remainder 2 years of the term for late Senator Jackie Winters, who passed away in May of 2019. Senate District 24 is the district currently represented by Senator Shamia Fagan. To take the role of Secretary of State, she will need to resign from her legislative seat, at which point a 30-day clock will begin for the district that represents Southeast Portland, Milwaukee, Happy Valley, and North Clackamas. There are a few steps along in that process. For the sake of time, I won't go into detail unless you all have questions, but that will culminate in a joint convening of Multnomah and Clackamas County Commissioners to select the new state senator from that district. And finally, in House District 33, Maxine Dexter was appointed earlier this year to fill the seat of the late Representative Mitch Greenlick, and then later elected to fill that seat for the next session. The 2021 session will be her first legislative session representing that district. Moving on to a preview, or I should say a summary of 2020 ballot measures. 4 measures were on the statewide ballot this year, and all 4 passed. I won't go into detail about each one of these, again, unless anyone has specific questions. I would like to highlight, though, that measures 107, 108, and 110 will likely have some policy and budget implications for our advocacy work in Salem for the next session. With Measure 107's passage and the additional room for the state to legislate campaign finance regulations, this will likely result in numerous proposals for campaign finance legislation in the next session. The Office of Government Relations will be vigilant in the next session to ensure that local elections law is considered in the construction of that statute and to protect local voter approved measures like publicly funded elections from any preemption. The tobacco and e-cigarette tax increases the tobacco tax by $2 a pack and will fund services at the Oregon Health Authority. Under the prior tax, prior to the passage of the measure, local governments received a share of the revenue from that tax. With the passage of this measure, it will not lessen the current share that local governments receive, but all new revenue will go to the Oregon Health Authority and will not increase local government share. Measure 110 has a few components, including drug reclassification, addiction treatment centers, oversight and accountability, as well as drug treatment and recovery services funding. Specific to that funding mechanism, that will draw on existing funding from state cannabis tax revenues. The collections of those revenues in the 2020 fiscal year was around $133 million at a statewide level. The measure will cap that revenue at $45 million for the existing funding formula that includes local governments, schools, the Oregon State Police, and direct the remaining revenue to addiction and treatment services per the direction in the measure.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So can you give us a little bit more detail about who actually provides the addiction services? Is that going to go through how does that money actually get translated into services in Portland?
Commissioner-elect Mapps, that's an excellent question. I'm happy to take a deeper dive into the language of the measure and follow up with you or any other member of council. What I will say is that much of the direction in the measure is toward the Oregon Health Authority. And so there will likely be significant conversations during the next session about how to set up the infrastructure for treatment centers that the measure directs and fund those treatment centers. And then we'll obviously consider through that process what the implications for the Portland metro area are.
Okay, thank you.
And if there are no questions, I will now turn the presentation over to Stacey Cowan to talk about the timeline leading into the next legislative session.
Thank you, Eric. Mayor, Commissioners, Commissioner-elect, my name is Stacey Cowan. I manage the State Government Relations Program. Thanks for the opportunity to present to you this morning. So looking ahead over the next several months, our team is going to be very busy preparing for session. You'll see during the weeks of December 7th and December 15th, those are interim legislative days where committees are going to meet to discuss items that they anticipate moving on during session. On January 6th, we are going to be back before you for our agenda approval. January 11th is the beginning of organizational days where you will see bills that have been pre-session filed. That's our first opportunity to start reviewing legislation that we'll be discussing during session. And then that'll be followed by the first official day of session on January 19th. It's important to note that while session is statutorily scheduled to begin January 19th, we do not yet know how it's going to proceed with regard to COVID-19 precautions. You can imagine there are a lot of challenges to holding a full session in a virtual manner, and of course, significant public health concerns with holding a session in the traditional sense. Additionally, there is a possibility that we could see legislative leadership put limits on the number of bills that legislators can introduce in order to help manage the workload for session. There is also a possible special session being planned for late November or early December. The best information that we have right now is that that would be likely the week of November 23rd. The scope is still to be determined. And then lastly, we're working to schedule the annual Portland Legislative Delegation Breakfast. We're aiming for a time after our agenda approval, but before session begins for a virtual discussion with our Portland delegation. On to the next slide. So we saw the 2020 short session end with a mountain of unfinished business due to a lack of quorum. We quickly pivoted to navigating a worldwide pandemic and calls for racial justice. The Joint Emergency Board has met 11 times since the 2020 session, and that includes 10 times since the COVID-19 emergency declaration by the governor. And then, of course, we saw catastrophic wildfires in the weeks after Labor Day. So for all of these reasons, the to-do list for the 2021 session is long. And you'll see some of the issues that we expect to be discussed this session are going to include COVID-19 response and recovery, housing, state budget shortfalls, police accountability, behavioral health. Something of note is that a lot of the items that we anticipate prioritizing are priorities of legislative leadership as well. So for the next slide, what I'd like to do is I'm going to walk you through the draft state legislative agenda for 2021. We have 2 slides here where Eric and I will outline 6 themes. Please feel free to stop me with questions or feedback as we go through this. And I wanted to mention also, as Elizabeth stated at the beginning of our presentation, and we also outlined in the preamble in the document that you received on Friday, our office is committed to centering racial and disability equity in our state policy and budget advocacy work. So the first—
Actually, before we start, Mr. Mayor and Stacey, may I ask a question?
Jump in.
Absolutely.
Just to sort of set the stage for the next stage of our presentation, can you give us a quick overview of where the state is at in terms of budget cuts and what they're dealing with?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That is a good question. So the most recent forecast that we had was in late September 23rd, I believe, if memory serves. And so the forecast surprisingly reflected a much greater revenue for the state than it was anticipated. Folks had really had some significant concerns and folks ended up being a little surprised. But the outlook for the future biennia is still not good. It's just not quite as bad as projected. I'm happy to follow up with some specific numbers. We will see potential budget cuts on the table for state agencies, and there's longer term conversations about what the impact is from COVID in future biennium. And I don't know, Eric, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Yes, Stacy was absolutely right, and I think I can put a little bit of a finer point. So the state has received 2 quarterly economic and revenue forecasts since the beginning of the governor's emergency declaration, and particularly since the beginning of the Stay Home, Save Lives order. In September, as Stacy mentioned, the revenue outlook changed relative to the forecast, noting that the revenue collections for the state in this current biennium were much higher than anticipated, with an expectation that the state will have an ending fund balance $1.7 billion higher than they had projected in May. That being said, the revenue collections outlook for the 21-23 biennium that we're heading into still does not look good. And insofar as we have a higher ending fund balance, that still represents one-time funding for the state that Ways and Means lawmakers will likely not consider for ongoing programs. The additional point to add some perspective is that after the second special session and budget cuts the legislature made, the planned spending for this current biennium sits at about $21.9 billion for the Joint General Fund Lottery Fund. The projected revenue incoming for the next legislative session stands at 22.1. That's flat for where we're spending now. Over the last 4 biennia, the state has seen an average of a 15% growth biennia over biennia in collecting revenue. So we are already starting from a deficit point. The other thing I would add is that the pandemic also has exacerbated the needs for services that the state provides. So while we're seeing decreased revenues, we're also seeing increased need, which widens the gulf between what the state is taking in revenues and what they can provide. The next forecast is a week from tomorrow, November 18th, and we should learn more after that, as well as get a sense of what the scope of some of the cuts for next session might look like in the governor's recommended budget coming out on December 1st.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Eric. So looking ahead, the first priority outcome is pursuing legislation specifically directed at eliminating racial disparities. This includes passing the Oregon Cannabis Equity Act to provide equal opportunity for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx ownership in the growing cannabis industry, addressing racial disparities in home ownership, and requiring racial impact statements for all legislative bills to analyze potential impacts to BIPOC communities. The second priority outcome is to improve police accountability. This includes passing legislation to implement the Community Police Oversight Board, including looking at the possibility of simplifying access to police records through the lead system, reforming qualified immunity for law enforcement officers, reforming burden of proof standards in arbitration, and continuing work on the statewide database for misconduct and discipline to improve transparency, and reimagining emergency response, such as additional support for the Portland Street response.
Excuse me, Stacy, for the implementation of Community Police Oversight Board, The very specific legislation that we need is really to change arbitration so that a community oversight board's decision is final. So were you thinking more than just that in that bullet point, or is there additional changes? You did mention about easier access to police records. Is there something else that's also included?
Yeah, additionally, thank you for the question, Commissioner. Additionally, we're looking at the possibility of drafting legislation, or we have drafting legislation being drafted that would allow us to implement the Citizen Oversight Board without first having to collectively bargain the impacts to discipline. With this new community police oversight board with the ability to investigate, it would be helpful and more efficient to be able to do that work without first having to bargain over the impacts to discipline, which are currently mandatory subjects of bargaining per state statute.
And so we have that, as well as looking at access to the LEDS database system, because we know that's been a hurdle to accessing materials to actually have transparent oversight.
Right, right. Thank you. I guess my question again, I guess it's always what comes first, the chicken or the egg? If this legislation passes, say, in December special session, and we start contract talks in January, we are talking about the next contract and not the actual contract that we are currently in. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, if we wanted the legislation to say that it would not impact a current collective bargaining impact, then current collective bargaining contract, then it would impact the next contract. I believe that's part of the reason that we wanted to move forward with this legislation during the 2021 session, is to begin that conversation. And I think those are just discussions that we can have about how this timing works and what the possibilities would be in order to be able to efficiently implement this new oversight board.
I would encourage you, Stacey, to talk to the People of Color Caucus, who have this as a centerpiece of their agenda. And it is my belief that the plan is to try to get this passed during a special session, because yes, that's the goal.
That's great. Thank you, Commissioner. Looking ahead, the third priority outcome is to stabilize individuals and families in recognition that the current public health and economic crises have exacerbated existing instability with individuals and families. So this includes advocating for emergency rent assistance to keep people housed, supporting mortgage interest deduction reform to increase state funding for housing needs, improving behavioral health services and supports, especially as it relates to workforce and housing options, establishing a statewide water, wastewater, and stormwater utility rate assistance program, and expanding energy rate assistance, improving digital equity and inclusion by providing devices and affordable, reliable internet service for BIPOC Portlanders, people with disabilities, older people, and low-income individuals, continuing support for the Oregon Worker Relief Fund for people and families left out of state and federal support systems, and support for funding and expansion of legal aid services, including immigration defense services, eviction prevention, and expungement, designed to support immigrant communities, renters, and BIPOC Oregonians. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to wait until you got through that. I'm trying to connect the dots. So the big picture topic for me is mental health system. Mm-hmm. People know our state's kind of dead last on that. And it really relates to a lot of the dialogue we've been having, connected, in my opinion, to the Portland Street response. So I realize you touched on that at the end of police accountability. And then I wanted to connect the dots with the bullet on improved behavioral health services and supports, and then tied into the measure that was passed. I realize that this is, we don't ever operate in an island, so this is connected to the state, it's connected to the county, But one point I've been trying to articulate is, we're building a response system to those with mental health episodes with Portland Street response skill sets, where we put in some money in the bump to build the dispatch system. But there's this big, awful void on where you take people for rehabilitation. Where do you really take them? Where is that place? And, this goes back to Ronald Reagan, of course. So this is not like this didn't show up overnight. So I think my pause right now in the dialogue, unless there's more slides, is where's the pieces to the puzzle on how we partner with the state so that we start to build this system in Multnomah County as we reimagine community safety.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I think that you raise a good point. Behavioral health is incredibly important to the city of Portland. And it's interesting that while not a direct service provider, clearly one of the top priorities for us to have a fully functioning system that actually serves individuals. So we actually work incredibly close with Multnomah County and partnering with stakeholders and really lifting up the work that they're doing at the county. We create this and sort of create these bullet points, but this behavioral health piece clearly has a tremendous connection to the work being done at Portland Street Response. And the work that we've been talking about prioritizing with Multnomah County is really lifting up the recommendations from the Governor's Behavioral Health Advisory Council. And I know that that's been a big focus of the work that Multnomah County is doing. So that's the connection with the state there and supporting the recommendations, including policy changes that are directly responsive to and driven by communities of color, the tribal community, and people with lived experiences. And I know, I'll just say that I think that the list of things that needs to be done is extensive. And so we can have good conversations about where we can best prioritize our time. I know the county will be talking a lot about workforce, making sure we have a highly qualified, diverse workforce, looking at retention and recruitment, as well as respite care. And those are some of those pieces. So, I would love to follow up with you and talk about areas of interest for you, in particular areas that you think the city can be a key partner in.
Thank you. I just realized that this is a moment that we have to align with our other jurisdictions to get on the same page about, building something that's wildly inadequate, even in a country where it's inadequate. Our state tends to land dead last, and just calling that out, because much of the dialogue we've been having lately on community safety system, we know that this is the complex arena that we have to build in. And so I just want to make sure that we're connecting the dots, and I was trying to see the passage of that one measure as providing some revenue streams for this, of course. And anyway, I look forward to the continuing of this messy and challenging and exciting opportunity.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Next, I'd like to go ahead and turn it back over to Eric to walk through our final three outcomes.
Thanks, Stacy. The fourth priority outcome in the city's draft agenda is support for Portland businesses and nonprofits. We know that Portland businesses and nonprofits are struggling to survive and adapt during this protracted public health emergency. And this priority will focus on both the continued challenges associated with the response to the pandemic and with an eye toward the recovery, including commercial tenant protections for small businesses that face evictions and foreclosures due to COVID-19 impacts, including protections for credit and personal assets of small business owners, and resources for small businesses otherwise hindered from accessing traditional federal funding streams. And to Commissioner Udaley's point earlier in the presentation, this includes a focus on cannabis businesses adversely impacted by the pandemic and on the supply side from wildfires, as well as undocumented immigrant-owned businesses, among others. One note on the scope of this section: it's difficult to predict where the state will be on the spectrum between crisis response and recovery in the 6 to 9 months forward that will be in the middle of the legislative session. Our hope is to continue working with council offices, city bureaus, and the community to identify what some of the priority outcomes need to be for the city to advocate on when it comes specifically to a recovery framework during the next legislative session. The fifth priority outcome, the Advance Environmental and Climate Justice to Build an Equitable Future outcome, focuses on, first, passing the energy democracy package of bills, which includes the PUC equity legislation the city supported in the last legislative session, as well as 5 other concepts aimed at moving the state to full and equitable decarbonization of Oregon's energy sector. Second, supporting legislation to allow cities to adopt the REACH code as the mandatory building energy code within a city's jurisdictional boundary to support the city of Portland in reaching net zero energy and carbon goals for new construction. And finally, supporting funding for levee repair and accreditation and recapitalizing the Brownfield Redevelopment Fund to support projects that center environmental justice, increase community resilience, and prioritize frontline communities. Our final priority outcome is the perennial item in our agenda around preserving and enhancing local authority. Local authority is critical to the city of Portland's ability to nimbly and effectively respond to the needs of the Portland community, consistent with the city's priorities and values. In the next session, the city will seek to pass legislation authorizing local speed setting authority for city-owned streets and make permanent the pilot project authorizing the use of fixed photo radar, clarify state statute to ensure attorney-client privilege is treated the same in the public sector as in the private sector, gain statutory authorization for federal background checks for Revenue Division employees, and establish flexibility in the homebuyer opportunity limited tax exemption program. I will note the issues of local speed setting, background checks, and the Holte fix will all be redrafts of bills from the 2020 legislative session. And finally, the italicized point about defending against attempts to limit local authority is placed there to highlight the significant portion of our work focused on preserving the city's existing programs and functions where we anticipate possible legislation, including regulation of emerging technologies, tenant protections and relocation assistance, system development charges, water, wastewater, and stormwater systems, local elections law, including publicly financed elections, and franchise fees and right-of-way management, among others. And I'll pause here for any questions.
And we should also note this concludes, yeah, go for it, Commissioner Ryan.
Commissioner Daly and Commissioner.
Oh, thank you.
Just a couple quick comments. Number one, I'm glad to see the flexibility for fixed photo radar and local speed setting authority under preserving and enhancing local authority. That really doesn't go as far as my office had requested. What we are looking for is a change in state law that will allow local jurisdictions to delegate traffic enforcement as they see fit. Currently, Oregon law and the Constitution require deputized officers to issue any moving violations. And this is an emerging national conversation. The possibility of removing some, if not all, traffic enforcement from police bureaus because of how problematic it has become, and the racial injustice perpetuated by police bureaus through traffic enforcement. So I would really encourage my colleagues to consider that. My office has been working with Unite Oregon at odds with each other. I believe it's outdated and we need to look at it. We recently revised our tree code and we removed the exemption for a lot of industrial lands, but we couldn't remove it for the heavy use industrial lands because of Goal 9 and how close we were to that inventory. So another nerdy little detail, but I think vitally important to how we manage our industrial lands moving forward. And hello,
Oh, hi, Commissioner. Thank you for the comments. I really appreciate it. So to your first point, our office is including, it's not explicitly outlined here when it comes to the conversation around who can review the fixed photo radar tickets. I actually am looking at that in my purview around the sort of reimagining emergency response. And I realize that's kind of a vague bullet point, but that is something that we're pursuing, the possibility. It has a broader implications, but it definitely is under that umbrella of who are the appropriate folks, what is the appropriate use of law enforcement. So that is something that is on our work plan, and it's something that we're looking to see if there's a possibility to either include that in the legislation that makes permanent the pilot project, or if that would be something that would make better sense in a different standalone legislation. And then to your question around Goal 9 and the tree code, again, not explicitly called out here, but definitely something that we wanted to be able to speak with council about. I'll say after the council conversation, I believe last week, maybe the week before, our office went back and did some work and did some digging. And, first I'll say that, when evaluating an item for consideration, one of the criteria that we look at is, have we exhausted all other possibilities before looking at a state statute change? And in speaking with staff, folks indicated that they felt that the city might have some latitude and flexibility to address the issues that have been raised through the EOA update. Mm-hmm. And folks feel that there might be some opportunity to really test those limits of Goal 9 and the interpretations, and to consider really how we're balancing those competing interests. And then the other thing that I will say is that, an additional consideration is the process to change a state land use goal is incredibly expensive, incredibly time consuming. And we know, Eric's fantastic information on the state budget. DLCD is looking at possible state budget cuts. So, for those reasons, we wanted to have the conversation with council. It doesn't quite feel like this issue is ready for state legislation, but of course, our office is happy to continue talking about that if that's the direction of council.
Thank you, Stacy. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I will say that this is an issue that has come up over and over again in the last 4 years I've been in office, and I think for many years prior. So hopefully one day we'll be able to tackle it, because I do think we're gonna, run into a wall eventually. And for my colleagues, I just want to share that 99% Invisible did a really great podcast episode called Policing the Open Road. And there's also a book of the same name by Sarah Sow, if anyone's interested in learning more about this issue, because as I said, it's relatively new. It's really an emerging conversation, national conversation, but Portland and Oregon, I think, have a chance to lead on this issue. And finally, for the photo radar issue.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan.
I'm not quite done, Mayor. Portland Police Bureau has deprioritized traffic enforcement, and as we heard recently, threatened to eliminate it altogether if their budget was cut. We adopted Vision Zero as a city, and although we have invested millions of dollars in improving the safety of our transportation infrastructure, and we've run educational campaigns, we're really lacking on enforcement. Radar cameras are unbiased up front. They're safer. I believe they will be more cost effective over time. However, currently only a sworn officer can issue those citations. The Police Bureau has only given us one FTE to do that. So even if we increase those cameras, we don't have the capacity to increase citations. And while the cameras themselves do provide disincentive to breaking the law, what the most effective aspect of cameras is the speed in which a person receives that citation, letting them know that they did violate our laws. So if we want to bring our annual death toll down from traffic collisions, this is vitally important. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah, I'll try to be really brief. I realize we're running out of time. I just wanted to call out two of your areas that I think in these fascinating times are going to be really important. The partnerships with our nonprofits and especially our small businesses is going to be really big, and they've been hurt, I think, in a deeper way than some other sectors, if you will. And we need that nimbleness and creativity as we partner to build back. And I also was mentioned earlier, like where you might find is a hunch. And I realized I might as well just tell you my hunches, since we seldom have these opportunities to be all together. But when you mention rural urban opportunities to build bridges, I believe it's in the Preserve and Enhance Local Authority. So I would suggest leaning in there. Thanks.
Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you. On the Goal 9 industrial lands inventory, this has been a problem for the 30 years that I've been involved in environmental advocacy. And it's something that I have raised on several previous occasions as something that needs to be in the legislative agenda. I dispute that with whomever told you that the economic opportunities analysis is going to somehow solve the problem, because we are usually told that it means that we can't do the environmental protection that we want. So I would request that you add some urgency to this. And I know that we have to start talking with other jurisdictions. However, we are one of the few landlocked jurisdictions. So it seems like there could be something that would be for landlocked jurisdictions of over 500,000 or something like that. And I would really ask that you push on this, because otherwise we're going to be told that we have to change green spaces into industrial land. We're going to be told that we have to annex West Hayden Island. It's coming to a head, and it really needs to happen on an expedited timeline. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Fritz. And Commissioner Hardesty.
Let me say I agree with Commissioner Udaley and Commissioner Fritz on Goal 9. I think we can't keep putting that down the road to try to resolve it. But the other issue under Preserve and Enhance Local Authority, recently there was a public records request for cell phone numbers of all city employees that someone wanted to get so they could put it on a personal website that they were running. And I'm very concerned about that information. Of course, the city is suing to prevent the release of that information, but being able to change public records law so that we will not be required to give out that kind of personal information about our employees, I think would be very helpful as we move forward. I don't see the polarization issue being resolved anytime soon. And so being able to protect our employees against invasions of privacy, I think it's really critical.
Very good. Thank you. Colleagues, we are now at the end of our time. Is there anything else that anybody wanted to sneak in the last minute or so? Very good. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, actually, if I could, I just want to quickly thank staff for this excellent, the hard work they did on pulling together a draft agenda and their excellent presentation today.
Thank you, Commissioner-elect Mapps, and thank you all. This was a very good work session. Thank you to Elizabeth and the entire team. Vicki, thank you for the federal perspective. This is a great starting point for all of us. Where we take this from here is we digest it. People think about the various components that were presented today. There, of course, are opportunities for people to add or subtract from this agenda going forward. This is really just the beginning part of the conversation, but I'll say on the whole, I think that our government relations team has done an outstanding job of putting together the priorities that do reflect the priorities of this council and the city. So thanks for your great work. We are adjourned.
Thank you so much.